Hello, and welcome to my podcast, Seattle Creatives. This is the story about a local author and filmmaker I met serendipitously at our local corner store. Her name is Deirdre Timmons. Her writing brings me to tears of reflection, as well as tears of joy, which often send me falling off my couch in laughter. Before we begin, I want you to imagine for a moment. Close your eyes, unless you're driving. Okay, you are the parent of a high schooler, the spouse of someone who has decided to leave tech and open a restaurant, the child of a mother who requires 24-hour care in the latter stages of dementia, and you have just been diagnosed with terminal, inoperable brain cancer. This is Deirdre's story.
Hello, this is Deirdre.
Hey, dear.
Hi.
Did you get the photographs of me in the sound booth?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, I'm
I'm
literally
sorry.
sitting on the floor. It's so funny. It's like maybe 8 foot by 4.5 feet.
Well, the one that I recorded for Audible was literally an old closet, and it was like 3 feet by 3 feet. It was 3 feet by 4 feet. It was so tiny. So I've probably been a writer all my life. When I was in high school and college, I would write everybody's essays because nobody wanted to write them. And I just loved writing them. And they would bring me their topics, and I'd spend 3 hours on an essay, and they'd get A's. And I didn't think anything of it at the time, except that I was cheating. But what happened is when I got out of college, I majored in English and discrete mathematics. And then my husband and I moved to Brussels, Belgium, and I could not get a job. But I finally did get a job freelancing for a magazine. It was the first time I'd ever written really professionally. And I had an article to write about a race, a double Ironman. And I had no idea how to write about sports. So I went to the library. This was back in the day when you had libraries and you had to go to them to do your research. And I checked out a Sports Illustrated magazine. And I wrote down exactly like what does an article look like, because I had never taken journalism. And I basically just took the structure from these articles and mimicked it. And then I'd circle words that seemed like sports words. So I would circle words like whopping and speed and all that. And the people loved the article. And from there, this was an English-based magazine in Brussels. They hired me to keep writing. And when we moved back to Seattle from Brussels, I went to a newspaper and just walked in and said, "Hi, I want to be a writer." And they said, "Everybody does." But I said, "Do you have any jobs available?" And they had a job as a news clerk. So I started writing calendar events, which moved on to wedding announcements, which moved on to obituaries, which then started moving on to small stories. You know, somebody's garden is spectacular this spring, or, you know, just very nominal stories. And from there, my newspaper farmed me out to one of their smaller newspapers, and I became, dun, 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 a reporter. So I was at this small newspaper for about 2.5 years when one of my former writing teachers hired me to work on this thing called the Internet. So I became a writer for the Internet covering arts and entertainment. And when I told all my colleagues at the newspaper I was doing this, they said, "Oh, Deirdre, no, don't work on this thing. It's not going to go anywhere." Like 3 years later, I was hiring all of them because they had realized the writing was on the wall and that newspapers were dying. Even that early on, when all of the newspapers were still thriving, they were cutting staff and cutting staff and cutting staff. So anyway, I worked online. I did some work for Microsoft, did some work for Nintendo, all as a writer and an editor, and then started taking classes in screenwriting, and found immediately that that's where I wanted to go, in the direction of fun and music and comedy. And that sort of lit the fire for me that I was never going to go back to newspapers or the internet. And my mentor at the time said, hey, learn how to make films and make your own. So I did. I went to UW, screenwriting school and filmmaking school, and made my first movie, which was a documentary on burlesque. Well, that did pretty well, actually. And then I launched into my second film, which was going to be a musical narrative about men who do burlesque. And I started to get very sick. And I didn't know why. I was dizzy all the time, tired, confused, forgetful, and I didn't know why this was happening to me. Because I'm usually, if I have a project, I can't let it go. But on this project, I couldn't keep it together. And finally, after a trip to Los Angeles to raise money for the film, I woke up one morning after a business dinner the night before, and I was covered in bruises. And I had lost a lot of weight that month, and there was no reason for it. And I was dizzy. I was getting dizzier and dizzier and dizzier. So when I got back to Seattle from that business trip, my husband said, maybe it's time to call a doctor. And I was like, no, I'm just dizzy. It's no big deal. My mom's dizzy all the time. But she had Alzheimer's, and she was forgetful, but she had Alzheimer's, and she was confused, but she had Alzheimer's. So I thought, well, I probably just have early onset Alzheimer's. There's no need for me to start going to doctors and getting expensive tests and all. And so I went to a dizziness clinic, and this guy had me do a bunch of things. He's cut sugar out of your diet. So I did that for a week, and he goes, okay, now do these exercises for a week, and you'll find your dizziness will abate. Well, it didn't. It just got worse and worse and worse. And it got to the point where I was on a walk in Madrona, and I just fell over flat into a bush for no reason whatsoever. And then my husband said, I think it's time that we go to a real doctor for this. So I did. I had an MRI, and they found something, but they didn't know what it was. And then I had another CAT scans of blood tests and whatnot. And then finally it culminated with a biopsy, a brain biopsy. And in the biopsy, they determined that I had an inoperable, fast-growing, malignant brain tumor. And at the time, I was given a month to a year to live.
Deirdre's tumor was a fast-growing, inoperable, malignant brain tumor called a medulloblastoma in her right cerebellum. In her words, as she later described to me via text, and I quote, a medulloblastoma is essentially embryonic brain cells that normally die off after birth. But those little baby cells didn't die in my brain. They just hung around for 46 years, only to reemerge as a tumor.
Well, that was heady news. I had a daughter that was still in high school. My husband was trying to open a restaurant. I was working on my film. And I was taking care of my mother, who was in an increasingly advanced stage of Alzheimer's. So it was a really inconvenient time to be dying of cancer.
At this point, Deirdre had exhausted her resources for second and third opinions, as so few physicians in North America were studying and treating this kind of cancer in anyone over 20 years old.
But anyway, many doctors later, we finally got my medical team together, and I decided to go with what's called proton therapy for radiation, because there are two kinds of popular radiation therapies for brain cancer. One is, and there are others, but I'm just going to list the two that I was being introduced to. One is photon therapy, which is they shoot photons to your tumor, but the only problem with photon therapy is like shooting a bullet. All of the photon radiation that comes in one end goes out the other end of your body, which for me was really dangerous because they were going to shoot my whole brain with radiation and my entire spine, because the kind of blastoma I had travels to the spine. And then the other kind of therapy is proton therapy, which is more like a grenade. You shoot it at the location and it dies on impact. So we ended up going with proton therapy. It's not easy when somebody tells you you're dying. Your first reaction is, no, I can't be dying. But then you start to absorb that information, and you literally feel like when you think you're dying, like your soul is leaving the earth. And that's what it was like for me. I began to feel like I was half in this world and half in some other unidentified world. And it was super dramatic. I literally, in my mind at least, started to die. And dealing with that, saying goodbye to my daughter, saying goodbye to my husband, letting go of my dreams, and saying goodbye to my mother, whom I was her primary caretaker. It was bizarre, frightening, and super dramatic. And there's nobody you can really speak to about it who's not going through it. And you can't discuss your impending death with somebody really, because it's such a unique and individual experience. So I did what I thought I should do, and I, cleaned out my closets, and I wrote my obituary, and I got all my legal stuff and my will done so that I could leave this world, and at least the details of my life would be taken care of. So the next month, I was in my proton therapy, which is the radiation I was getting. And to explain how extreme it was, most radiation treatments are between 10 and 15 minutes for people, the typical cancers. Mine were between 2 and 4 hours. So I was basically in massive lockdown. I could only move my tongue and my toes during treatment, and sitting there just gritting through hours of radiation. And in order to be able to do that, I would get up in the morning and walk as far as I could walk, which was then 2-3 miles. Then I would eat a huge carby meal. And then when I got to the proton therapy center, I would take a Valium. And that was enough to just make me so exhausted that when I got into my radiation shell and they locked down my face, I could relax because I was so exhausted, so full, and pumped up on Valium. So anyway, fast forward to the end of treatment, I made it through, and at the same time I was taking chemo. So I lost all my hair, and I was on a lot of steroids. So I had gotten quite thin. It was getting all pumped up from it. And, they were all, you have to read the book, but many side effects from radiation and chemo. Most of them highly unpleasant and shocking. But eventually I made it through, and they finished the radiation treatment, which P.S. burns you. So my whole face was burned, my ears were burned, my spine was burned, like a third-degree burn with blisters and everything, which I was not expecting. I just thought they were burning the inside of me, but it turns out the radiation was also burning the outside of me. But all of that went away eventually, and my hair started to grow back after that first month. And then I just went on a course of 9 months of chemo. So just as my hair was growing back, it fell out again because of the next round of chemo. Nothing like looking like a cancer patient. You know, you lose your hair, you gain weight, you lose weight, you get hair, you lose hair. But you're always, always tired. But I made it through, and I lived. So I did get to see my daughter grow up and graduate from high school and get into college. And I did get to see my husband open his restaurant. And I did get to see my mother through the end of her life. Like, not as much as I wanted, but definitely I spent as much time with her as I could. Which, when I hear people talk about how Alzheimer's is the long, slow goodbye, and they get all down and depressed like they've lost their family member or loved one, I found that with my mother, she was still there all the time. She had a great sense of humor, and she was funny till the very end. She didn't know who I was, or where she was, or why we were doing anything we were doing, but she was always funny, and I held on to that. I held on to the fact that my mother was still with me in some form, some identifiable form. And we had a great end of life together. You know, she would really bring me up when I felt down. And I could tell her my woes, my funny bits over and over and over again because she wouldn't remember. So she'd cry, and I'd talk about my cancer, and then she'd cry again. And then I'd totally switch and talk about other stuff, and she didn't remember. So it was kind of a strangely comforting thing to have a mother whom I loved and loved to spend time with. And we could share our woes. Like, she would say, I'm dizzy all the time. And I'd say, me too. Well, why are you dizzy? I'd say, because I have cancer. And she'd go, oh, no, who are you? I'd say, I'm your daughter. And she would say, you are? And I'd say, yeah, Mom, I'm your daughter. Why? Why are you my daughter? Well, Mom, because you got pregnant with me. Well, did I do that? How did I do that? So we would go through all these hilarious details. And then at the end of the conversation, she'd say, okay, so who are you? And this just went on and on and on. And I never tired of it. And I just loved bringing her little treats and taking her out to Starbucks or anything like that. And it's one thing I really wish to share with people who have parents or loved ones with Alzheimer's is to have fun with them. Help them have fun at the end of their life. And for cancer patients, I would say have faith in the medical community and allow yourself to try to figure out what your life might be if you don't survive, and to plan for that, but to really keep your eye on the ball of survival. And just humor was the hugest help. It was my coping mechanism. Because as long as you're smiling, really, you are releasing endorphins to help healing. And so I would watch comedies, only comedies, and hang out with friends and try to laugh with them and try to enjoy our time together so that, A, I would be hopefully healing from all of this happiness and happy joy. But also, if I didn't make it, we would have shared wonderful moments at the end of my life. And that became my MO for everything. And you know what? To this day, I haven't let go of it because I realized how important it is to be with family and friends, and how important it is to experience joy in life while you have your life. Let me go back. I blogged the whole time through it because I knew I had no memory. So every day I would take notes to my doctor's office and with my mom, and in every interaction I had it. And I would blog, take pictures. And so I had a full memoir written basically. I just had to come in and pad it and, smooth it out and add who all the characters were. And I really highly recommend people going through something this dramatic, write about it as you go along, because it helps you gain some outside perspective, like what are people going to read when they read this? And by removing yourself from the situation, you get a sort of an outside perspective. You're writing about yourself, but not in a way that is sort of sad, because you're telling your own story in your blog or in your journey or in your journal. And I found that to be very helpful as well. And then it really helped when I sat down to write, because everything was recorded, and all the thoughts at the time, and all the photographs, and all the memories, and the dialogues, and hence, Brain Candy was born. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, I'm just 26 minutes of holding back laughter and tears is kind of hard. Oh, man.
It's good to cry. It's good to cry. It encourages a lot of emotion. And it's also really good to laugh. It brings your emotion back up. So if you can get the sad out and then refill it with happy, it's a very powerful way of dealing with something so intense. Allow yourself to cry, but really allow yourself to laugh as well. We all go through it. We're all going to die, right? So just enjoy the time you have, regardless of, your age or what you're going through. Try to, hold on to your community and your people and love life together.
So, Deirdre, to end this interview, would you like to tell us a little bit about your second upcoming book, Recipe for Disaster?
Yeah, let's talk about the next project. So, I was born in Wichita, Kansas. My mother was a nurse, and my father was an engineer. My mother had a lifelong affliction of anorexia and or bulimia. My father was morbidly obese. So, food, for me, growing up, was crazy. I mean, my mother wouldn't let us eat, and then our father forced us to eat, and then my mother would make me throw up, and then my father would, blah, blah, blah. It just was this insane swirl of complete misunderstanding of healthy eating and healthy body positivity. But it was funny. They were both really funny, smart people, but completely crazy. And so my next book is called Recipe for Disaster. It's a memoir about growing up in this insane household where food was just completely confusing. And they did things that I write about, and I tell people, and people go, no, 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 no. I'll give you one example. So my dad had this obsession with us taking vitamins as children. And this was in the 70s. The pills would be huge. They were like horse pills, and they would grow by the week. Our bowls of pills for morning breakfast would grow and grow and grow. And one day my brother said, instead of taking one pill at a time and trying to choke down each one, he said, I'm going to put them all in my mouth at once and then swig them down. So my brother put all of these massive pills in his mouth, crammed his mouth, and then swigged it down with milk, and then immediately vomited back into his cup. So my dad, irritated with him, said, you think that's cute, Sam? You think you're being cute? Drink it. and he made my brother drink his own vomit. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So that's my next book. It's half written, and it's also really unbelievably sad and funny and hilarious. And it's also an ode to the 70s in the Midwest. So a lot of talk about food back then and parenting back then, being a child back then. I mean, in the 70s, your parents just kicked you out of the house and said, be back by dinner. And that was just, and it wasn't unusual. Nobody in the neighborhood thought, oh, your parents are weird, because their parents were doing the same thing. So it is a fun romp, and it's kind of unbelievable considering how we parent or how we idealize parenting now. So that'll be fun. That's going to be Recipe for Disaster. So stay tuned. Life is tough. Life is difficult. Life is weird. But also, life is funny. And I prefer to filter my entire experience on this great green earth through comedy. And I prefer to laugh at things that seem not very funny to many people. And in doing that, I've been able to grow up, grow old, with a smile on my face.